I'm going to start, and I'm going to speak very loudly and very clearly, and then it probably will be too loud in a minute. But every year, public libraries across the country participate in National Voter Registration Day. And this year, it's September 20th. And it's appropriate for public libraries to be part of this because we were founded on the principle that we were an institution that could protect democracy. And we protect it by cultivating an informed electorate. So voter education, near and dear to our hearts, and that's what we're here for tonight. We are beginning our celebration with a presentation by two speakers on overcoming barriers to voting, past and present. We'll continue this celebration by hosting a 7-week series of candidate forums in this room, Thursday nights at 7 p.m., starting next Thursday. We hope that tonight's presentation will encourage you to attend these events and to get to know the 32 candidates running in local, state, and national elections this year for Wilson County. Now, this will provide you, these events, these forums will provide you an opportunity to ask questions, to listen and learn more about the people whose names you will see on the ballot. Please take home the flyers in your chairs and write down your questions. There's a little form for your questions for the candidates, and bring them with you or submit them early to library staff. We'll take them here. And there are more on the table in the back if you have more questions. There are more flyers, and there are more forms, question forms. There's also a Friends membership form. We'd like you to consider joining our Friends group, of course. And we are a designated area institution for voter registration. So that we have voter registration forms here tonight. If you have not registered to vote, you could do that here and leave the form with us, and we'll deliver it to the Board of Elections. Tonight we have the pleasure of listening and learning more about the barriers to voting that exist now and in the past, as well as the importance of civic engagement and just doing our duty in voting each time there's an election. Welcome, come on in. First, I'd like to introduce our local historian, Lisa Henderson, a Mercy baby. Are you going to tell us what that is? I think I know. But you were born and raised in Wilson, and her interest in genealogy was sparked by a 5th grade family tree project, and then positively burst into flame when she discovered census records on microfilm in her university library. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in English from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a master's degree in American history from Columbia University, and a JD, Juris Doctorate, thank you, from Harvard Law School. I obviously don't have one. Harvard Law School, and is a practicing attorney. She maintains 3 genealogy and history blogs, and is especially proud of the work she does at Black Wide Awake, which is dedicated to the African American families and history of Wilson County. Lisa also spearheads Lane Street Project, a grassroots effort to reclaim and restore respect to 3 of Wilson's historic African American cemeteries. David McLennan earned his PhD in political science at the University of Texas and is currently a professor of political science at Meredith College, where he directs the Meredith Poll, a statewide survey of North Carolinians on politics. He's taught courses in American government, campaigns and elections, political leadership, women in politics, and more at Texas Christian, North Carolina State, and William Peace Universities. His research is widely published in academic and popular outlets on topics such as the impact of negative advertising on political attitudes, image restoration for politicians in trouble, political polling methodology, and barriers to women's electoral success. As a political analyst, he appears in news stories for local, state, and national media, publishes op-eds on a range of political topics that have most recently appeared in The Hill, U.S. News and World Report, and the News and Observer. Please join me in welcoming both our speakers.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. It's great to be back live. And by Mercy Baby, it means I was born at Mercy Hospital. As I would like to say, one of the last babies born in that great institution. So I am always happy to speak here at the library. I got my Wilson County Public Library card, first one in 1971. So I have always enjoyed, always loved the library. So always special to be here. So normally when I tend to talk about things that are a little further back in history. This is kind of recent for me, but am really excited about this topic. It was something that I really didn't know anything about until I started researching for Black, White, Awake. And it is the story of Wilson's first Black elected official and the campaigns that he ran. So his name was George Kenneth Butterfield. You may know that name, of course. But we are not talking about this George Kenneth Butterfield. This is George Kenneth Jr. We are talking about his father, whose 3 historic campaigns in Wilson in the mid-1950s ushered in the city's civil rights era. So first, just a point about terminology. We're talking about voter suppression. So sometimes people kind of speak in shorthand and they'll say, oh, well, you know, African Americans didn't have the right to vote until the 1960s, until the Voting Rights Act. So that's not true. Actually, there are 2 amendments that, of course, establish the right to vote. The 15th Amendment, which was passed shortly after the end of the Civil War, which granted the right to vote essentially to African American men. And then the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920, which expanded the right to vote to women. So African Americans have long had the right to vote, but state and local governments have often attempted to create barriers to the exercise of that right. And that's voter suppression. That's what we talk about when we talk about voter suppression. So after emancipation in Wilson County, African American men enthusiastically embraced their political rights. They formed, for example, a chapter of the Union League, which was a secret organization that mobilized freedmen to register to vote and educated them on Republican Party issues and candidates. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. Overwhelmingly, African Americans were members of the Republican Party at that time. From the 1870s through the early 1890s, African Americans engaged in local politics, including, for example, as poll watchers during elections. You see here, this is from Wilson, this actually probably was not the Daily Times. I think that's an error. So probably the Mirror from 1884. And you can see here there are poll holders. So these are people that kind of watched over the elections. And you see in the Wilson district, these are by township. There was Tom Johnson, colored in Toysnot, which is of course up around Elm City. Jolly Taylor was a poll holder. And in the Black Creek area, Jack Woodard and Woodard Williams were poll holders. So there were people involved, African-American men involved in politics throughout the period of Reconstruction and afterwards. though none were successful candidates for office, Wilson County was in the so-called Black Second Congressional District, which was a majority Black congressional district that stretched across eastern North Carolina, and elected men into Congress like James E. O'Hara and George H. White. And politically active men in Wilson, like Daniel Vick and his son Samuel H. Vick, benefited from political patronage, from being able to bring votes essentially to these candidates. So here we have, for example, an article from the Wilson Mirror, which talks about Sam Vick and his assistant Brazel Winstead, both African American, who headed the post office. That was a political patronage position at that time. Daniel Vick and Sam Vick had appointments starting in the 1880s. They were sort of back and forth as postmasters. This was hotly contested. This was very controversial. It was a job that came with a pretty hefty stipend and lots of controversy. But Sam Vick was able to hold on to that job until just after the turn of the century. So with the success of fusion politics in the mid-1890s, however, and fusion politics were basically populists and Republicans sort of agreeing to kind of work together against what was in the Democratic Party. State Democrats turned to white supremacy to rally their base. And this resulted in editorials like one that was published in the Wilson Times in 1896, which warned that annexing the Negro settlement east of the railroad would wipe out the city's white majority. So as is the case now, east of the railroad stood for the Black community in Wilson. And at that time, the railroad was essentially the town's eastern border. And there had been discussion about annexing that part of town, primarily for, the reason you always annex is to increase your tax base. But there was a warning, with that, this is what's going to happen. So, of course, in 1898, we have the Wilmington Massacre. We have a coup d'etat, the only one that's ever occurred on American soil, in which a duly elected government is overthrown in the city of Wilmington, and it changes North Carolina politics. 2 years later, North Carolina voters approved the suffrage amendment, which effectively disenfranchised African American voters. And it didn't completely end, but it pretty effectively ended public participation in via voting. So the disenfranchisement that came about as a result of the suffrage amendment was not a byproduct of that amendment. It was the point. And so here is a headline of an article that ran in the Wilson Daily Times in 1899. And this was in the lead up to the vote for the suffrage amendment. And it's very plain, white supremacy made permanent. This is what we're trying to do. This is why you should vote for this amendment. And what followed this article was sort of a point by point. It sort of went through the provisions of the amendment and explained why this amendment would achieve this goal. So by the first decade of the 1900s, while there were still a handful of African American voters in Wilson County, in North Carolina, really, voter suppression was as effective as it ever was going to be. The voter participation reached an all-time low during that period. So let's fast forward a few decades to 1928. Dr. George Butterfield, newly arrived in Wilson, is one of 46 registered voters in the town, 46. So who is Dr. Butterfield? He was a native of St. George's, Bermuda, migrated to the United States as a teenager to continue his education, served in the U.S. Army during World War I, graduated from Harriet Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee in 1927, arrived in Wilson shortly after, established a dental practice, married Addie Davis, and became quickly involved in numerous professional and civic organizations. And this is just, I found this in some of my grandmother's effects. My grandmother apparently went to see Dr. Butterfield in 1955. I don't know what she paid $7 for, but remember that date, 1955. We'll see that again in a second. I don't know why she saved this particular receipt, but that's 19. So by the 1930s and 40s, organizations like the Men's Civic Club and the Citizens Commission or Committee for Political Action had formed to support political and educational advancement of African Americans, including voter registration. Their efforts did not go unchallenged. In 1930, Democrats challenged the registrations of 39 African Americans prior to the Democratic primary in Wilson. All 39 were called into a hearing to explain, basically to be tested on the validity of their registration. 23 showed up at a hearing in which they were forced to answer questions about their political leanings and forced to tell who they would vote for. As a result, 18 were allowed to remain Democrat, 3 were reclassified as independent, and 2 were switched to Republican. Now these are people who are registered to vote, who are registered as members of a particular party, were questioned and had party affiliations. Many of them had their party affiliations switched. In 1947, pharmacist Darcy Yancey made a run for the Board of Aldermen, which was the equivalent of today's City Council. This was the announcement of his candidacy. Dr. Yancey lived on Green Street in the block just before where Darden High School was, now Vic Elementary School. That was the 4th ward. Wilson had 6 voting wards. That was the 4th ward. The 4th ward, despite having what would be the north side of Green Street, Vance Street, Viola, it was an overwhelmingly white district, and Dr. Yancey lost by a landslide. The following year, however, the Daily Times warned that large numbers of Negroes had newly registered to vote. And they specifically noted that there had been 223 Negro registrations and 129 white registrations. So you'll find that the Daily Times sort of doesn't ever really come up. There's nothing quite like the 1899, we are going to maintain white supremacy headline. But it's clear in the messaging, in what the Daily Times chooses to report, in the way that it chooses to report it, that it's signaling to voters, you need to watch out. Okay, this is what is happening. So by the 1850s, there were about 500 black voters registered. Almost all of them lived in the 3rd ward. The 3rd ward ran roughly, Nash Street, was the southern border, and then it ran sort of between Nash Street and Green Street. Now you know how, that's 2 blocks, right? 2 blocks, 3 blocks. And it ran all the way across town. So that's the 3rd ward. In April 1953, Dr. Butterfield announced his candidacy to represent the 3rd ward. He was running against an incumbent named Herbert H. Harris, and he immediately drew widespread support, particularly from the unionized tobacco leaf house workers, many of whom were working class black women, from churches, and from Wilson's small African American professional class. So this was an announcement of a meeting that was held in April of 1953. So the elections were very short. So he announced in April. the election was May 6th. So, you know, it's 2 or 3 weeks basically of a campaign. And this is, again, an announcement about a community mass meeting that in part was called to talk about better community representation. And Dr. Butterfield was a speaker at this meeting. A few days before the election, the incumbent, Herbert Harris, challenged the eligibility of 185 Third Ward voters. 150 of those voters were struck from the rolls as a result of the challenge. Of those 150, 147 were black. So on election night, when they tallied the votes for Dr. Butterfield and Mr. Harris, by some amazing fluke, each had received 382 votes. Exactly. Dr. Butterfield objected that the registrar had violated the rules requiring that votes be counted where the ballot boxes are open. Ballot boxes had been transported. So he challenged, he objected. The city attorney, W.A. Lucas, conceded that the vote had been irregular, but said that's beside the point because the city charter provided for a means of handling a tiebreaker. And over Dr. Butterfield's protests, the city clerk placed the 2 candidates' names in a hat. Dr. Butterfield asked that the names be pulled out. He wanted to see his name on the slip. So they showed it to him, they put it back in the hat, they blindfolded a 3-year-old girl. She drew a name from the hat, and Dr. Butterfield won. So that is how Dr. Butterfield won his first election.
Where's that little girl today?
Yeah. So back then, seats on the Board of Aldermen were 2 years. You had a 2-year term. So in 1955, the city of Wilson rolled up its sleeves to get ahead of Dr. Butterfield's re-election. First thing they did, threw out all the registration books. Literally threw them, they do not exist anymore for Wilson. They threw them away. And ostensibly, this was in order to clear the books of dead voters, of otherwise ineligible. I mean, does any of this sound familiar? Yeah. Dead voters, ineligible people. Okay, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Nothing. So citizens had less than a month to re-register. So these are the 6 wards in 1955. So here, of course, you've got, you see 1. Well, here's 6, which was, at that time, this is basically like 5 points in that area, south. 1, this diagonal is the railroad, okay, across. Okay. So you've got 1 over here, which is everything around, say, what is it, Stansburg Road now, down in that part. And then it crosses the road and goes all the way out to, you know, I confess, I don't know these neighborhoods very well. But everything, basically everything south of Nash Street, west, is also District 1. Ward 2 doesn't even try, right? It only has a corner across the railroad. The rest of it is all west. Ward 3, you've got the old, kind of what you might call the oldest part of East Wilson. So these streets are going to be, it's going to be like Church Street, Smith Street, Ash, Narrowway, East, Carolina. You know, this is the ward I grew up in my childhood. Then you have 4, which is where Dr. Yancey had lost, and you have 5, which was basically all white. So these are the wards. These are the polling places for each of these wards. So in order to register, you know, everybody's starting over from scratch. During the week, you have to go to the registrar's house to register. Because all the registrars live where? All the registrars live over here. But you have to go to the house. So first you gotta have time off work. Then you have to screw up your nerve to go knock on some person's door and register. So if you can't do that, if you can't get off work, then on Saturdays, on 2 Saturdays during that period, you could register at the polling place. Look at the polling place for the 3rd Ward. It's the courthouse. So you've now got to go and declare before God and country that you are registering to vote, that you are stepping out in 1955, and you're marching to the courthouse to register to vote. So this is again 1955. It's a difficult feat, obviously, for factory workers, for domestics, to meet this, to meet this task. And while they're at it, they expanded Ward 3 a bit, a little bit further west, grabbing a couple more white voters. The Wilson Daily Times, once again, did its part to kind of highlight the peril by doing running tallies of new voters. So here's April 8th. So here's how many people have registered so far by ward. White, colored. Like, let's here are the numbers, folks. Do your duty. So you can see now, so you see Ward 1, 2. The only ward that has a black majority is Ward 3. And it's hopeless. Ward 2, 99 to 1. Ward 5, 120 to 0. But this is a running tally that's published in the paper. So on election day, despite all of this, 93% of all eligible black voters voted. 93%. And George K. Butterfield Sr. won again. Won again. So now we're 2 years past, it's 1957. Faced with another Butterfield campaign, or the prospect of another Butterfield campaign, because he hadn't declared, the city went for the nuclear option. Chucked the whole ward system. Oh my God. And that had to be done by the legislature. You had to introduce a bill to the North Carolina legislature to change the system of voting that you use in a county or in a city. And they did. They opted for the new, fair, modern way of voting, which is at large. So what that means, of course, is that you don't just vote in, you can't create voting blocks. You can't consolidate voting strength. Every person in the city votes for every seat. And in highly segregated communities like Wilson particularly was, in 1957, it's going to be impossible to put together enough people to elect an African American. And to make it even more difficult, you couldn't just vote for one person in this campaign. You had to vote for 6. You had, when you cast your ballot, if you did not list 6 candidates, your ballot was eliminated. So in other words, every ballot that was cast for, I'm sorry, I missed this picture. This was Dr. Butterfield in 1955 being sworn in. But every ballot that was cast for Dr. Butterfield was cast as well for 5 of his opponents. So on top of that, Dr. Butterfield could not, because of Jim Crow, because of segregation, because of the era, Dr. Butterfield couldn't campaign in West Wilson. He couldn't go knocking on doors. He couldn't hold community meetings in which he talked to white voters and tried to introduce himself and tried to say, hey, here's who I am. and I'm actually a great guy that's interested in the whole community and would like to represent. He couldn't do any of that. He could only talk to black voters. So this is an ad that Edgar Norris ran in 1957. He laid it out. You know, Wilson has abolished the ward system. Candidates run at large. Voting is at large. Your vote doesn't count unless you mark your ballots for 6 commissioners. This is required by law. Just a reminder to everybody. So, unsurprisingly, Dr. Butterfield placed 8th among the 16 candidates. He was the only incumbent not reelected. The only one. So, you know, in the end, Dr. Butterfield lost. There was not another African American on Wilson City Council until 1974. Battles over the ward system, the at-large system, raged in the 1970s and 80s in Wilson. It was not until 1987 that the at-large system was abolished and a ward system was reinstituted in Wilson. At that time, there were 5 council seats, 5 wards. 2 of them, the maps were drawn so that 2 of the wards had majority black populations. 2 of 5, 40%, that's roughly the black population of Wilson. So, and then there were also fights in the county to do the same thing. You had a county commissioner system that was also at large. It was impossible for African Americans to get on that, to be elected to council. So even though this isn't, you know, the story of Dr. Butterfield's campaigns, his elections, ultimately is one of defeat. It's a story that, for me, is incredibly inspiring in terms of in terms of determination that African American voters showed, the understanding of the importance of fighting the system, the understanding of a man like Dr. Butterfield to put himself out, to do that, to be that target. The understanding that only when the city changed the rules of the game were basically to engineer voter suppression did Dr. Butterfield lose his seat. And so it's an inspiring story. It's a story that I think helps us I think understand, gives us context for what we see now, and I hope gives us encouragement about fighting voter suppression as we see it in its modern manifestations. So, thank you.
Well, first, let me say thank you to Lisa. I learned so much in that presentation, and so I hope you got as much out of it as I did. I thought that was outstanding. And there's a lot of overlap between what we're talking about. I'm talking about the country, she's talking about Wilson, but Wilson really is a microcosm of what we see nationally. So, Lisa, thank you very much. And the story that you told of perseverance by voters, I can't imagine going to the registrar's office or home to re-register to vote. The courage that took is just amazing. And then, of course, Dr. Butterfield, just the courage it took to run in the 1950s. Again, thanks you to Molly for inviting me and to all of you for having me. I'm going to keep my remarks. I prepared more than I need for tonight, so I'm going to keep my remarks pretty short because I think, answering questions, and I have some questions for Lisa that is such a fascinating story, so we can get to that relatively quickly. But I will move through some slides to kind of talk about national efforts at voter suppression. The message I'm going to say is that voting laws are always partisan. I mean, that came through in Lisa's presentation. All the things the Wilson officials, the state legislature did was clearly partisan. Well, as Lisa mentioned, the term voting does not appear for quite some time in the US Constitution. It's very inexact in most of the Constitution. The politics of ballot access, as Lisa mentioned, are very much partisan. There's always been a sustained effort to keep some group in or out of power, to improve its chances of winning elections or to hurt its chances of winning elections. So again, as we talk about the Constitution is very indirect in terms of talking about voting. It wasn't until the 15th Amendment, as Lisa said, that the term voting, the right to vote was given to a particular group of people. And then, as we know, after when Jim Crow got implemented at state level, many of those freedoms were lost. So we know whether you're a woman or a person of color, there had to be Herculean efforts undertaken to give the right to vote, but it wasn't always guaranteed. Again, we know this from taking our civics classes. White landowning males were the first people given the right to vote. It wasn't until the Jacksonian era that landowning was eliminated as a way to vote. The 15th Amendment, as Lisa said, was the first attempt to give the franchise to black men. That was done to help the formerly enslaved black Americans. But starting after 1877, lots of things happened. I'm glad, Lisa, you put up that state constitutional amendment that talked about literacy. That is still in the state constitution. Now, the federal constitution has been amended to eliminate literacy tests across the country, so it is not enforceable. But it is amazing in 2022, if you go through the North Carolina Constitution, there is still a literacy requirement. Now, the Supreme Court has been not always favorable to voting. And I will not tell you about all these cases, but it took lots of Supreme Court cases to eliminate such things as white-only primaries, poll taxes, literacy tests, again, still in the North Carolina Constitution. So from the time in which the 15th and 19th Amendments were added to the Constitution, it took lots of effort by individuals, by groups of people, to try to make it somewhat fair. Mississippi is an interesting case. It parallels North Carolina quite a bit. So the 1890 Mississippi Constitution basically implemented all the things to keep black voters from voting. Literacy tests, grandfather clause, poll taxes, all these were implemented. And the Supreme Court in 1898, remember what Lisa mentioned about what happened in Wilmington in 1898? It wasn't just happening in Wilmington, it was happening, not the violence, but political violence was happening to people in 1898. The Supreme Court said, of course Mississippi has the right to do what they did. Judicial discretion. As you go through the history of the Supreme Court, as it rules about voting, you see that the justices have a lot of discretion in terms of determining voting rights. Charles Evans Hughes, who was in the Supreme Court for quite some time, both as the Associate Justice and a Chief Justice, says the Constitution is what judges say it is. Well, that's pretty true in terms of voting. Let's just look at 1964. Now, why did I pick that date? What happened in 1965? The Voting Rights Act. All right, excuse me, we'll get back to that. In 1964, look at the percentage of white and black voters in Mississippi that were registered to vote. 5% of black voters were registered. This is, again, a little bit after what Lisa was talking about in Wilson. The barriers were still there in 1964. The Voting Rights Act has two provisions that really, what many historians and political scientists consider to be a near constitutional amendment, because it took the 15th and 19th Amendments and really gave force to those two amendments. In Section 4 said that there are certain jurisdictions that were, including parts of North Carolina, that really suppressed the right to vote through legal means. And then Section 5 is what is called a pre-clearance, that anytime people in those states or in those areas of states passed laws pertaining to voting, they had to automatically go to the Justice Department to get approved. It dealt with everything from drawing district lines to passing laws related to at-large versus ward kind of voting systems. So in 1965, North Carolina became a state where these kinds of things that Lisa talked about and other things were remedied. And those are all the jurisdictions that are under the original Voting Rights Act. The states in red were the entire states. North Carolina, there were counties, including Wilson County, that was under the Section 4 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And then it was amended in 1975. So again, the Voting Rights Act recognized that there was suppression going on in lots of places, even in places you would not have imagined, South Dakota. But again, that was what happened in 1965 and 1975. But let's look how the vote went on the Voting Rights Act. We think of it now some 50-some years later as being this wonderfully well-supported law. It was not. In the US Senate, only 5% of Southern senators voted for the Voting Rights Act. Non-South, non-Southern senators, 100% of senators voted for it. And the same is true in the House. So the South was still fighting to suppress the vote, even in the Voting Rights Act. It passed just because, of course, the rest of the country outvoted the Southern senators and House members. But let's look at the impact of the Voting Rights Act in those key Southern states. 2 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, again, we went from 5% in Mississippi of black voters being registered to vote, eligible black voters, to 60%. So again, dramatic impacts just because of the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But again, Southern senators and House members did not want this to happen. The Supreme Court became more favorable to voting. Justice Hugo Black said this: "No right is more precious in a free country than that of having a voice in the election of those who make laws under which we as good citizens must live." He said basically, if you didn't have the right to vote, all the other laws passed really didn't matter. Think about that today in 2022. We have a lawsuit in North Carolina basically saying because of gerrymandering, the districts are so gerrymandered that laws, including constitutional amendments that were put on the North Carolina ballot in 2018, are unconstitutional because people's right to vote was suppressed because they were drawn into districts that were cutting into their right, their one person, one vote mandate. So it's existing today. Let's move ahead to 1993. So the Democrats said, okay, we're going to try to pass something that's more favorable to giving people the right to vote, called the Motor Voter Act. You might remember that in 1993. That was trying to increase voter registration. So when you got your driver's license or you registered your car to vote, you could then register your car, then you could register to vote. I mean, before 1993, it would be very difficult to come to the Wilson Public Library and register to vote. You had to go to your Board of Elections. So the 1993 Motor Voter Act was proposed by Democrats, signed into law by Bill Clinton, but look how the vote went. Republicans didn't want that vote to happen, didn't want that act to pass. Why? More people that vote, they favor Democrats. Again, partisanship. The Democrats' incentive, if you look at whether you're looking at income level, you're looking at race and ethnicity, whatever measure you want to look at, before the Motor Voter Act and after the Motor Voter Act, there were more people at the lower third of socioeconomic status who benefited from the Motor Voter Act. Makes sense, right? Lisa told us about the people who re-registered by going to the registrar's house. Well, again, what the Motor Voter Act did was make it much easier to register to vote. Clearly, it helps people of color, helps people who are poor, helps people who work. Republicans didn't want it, Democrats did. Republicans fought this through the courts. However, the Supreme Court essentially said it's perfectly legal to do. So the Motor Voter Act, even though it was challenged by Republicans in many states around the country using the Articles 1 and the 10th Amendment, the Supreme Court basically said, I'm sorry, you can't abridge someone's right to vote by telling them they have to register in a certain way. Turnout went up. Those political scientists say 3 or 4% higher. So the fact that it's not just about registering to vote, it's about voting. And the ultimate conclusion, this is what I think is important to say, is there has not been demonstrated a partisan advantage in voting. Republicans fought it tooth and nail. They voted against it in Congress. They took it to the courts. In the long run, it did not disadvantage them. And so one of the messages that I hope you'll take away both from Lisa's talk and my talk tonight is there's a lot of effort to suppress votes. People, you and I, can overcome that in many ways, and most efforts are not advantageous in the long run to one party or the other. So things that are going on in 2022, you know what's going on in other states. Georgia's passed a very regressive kind of voting law, making it difficult to vote. I used to live in the state of Texas. It's very difficult to vote. It's the number 50 state in the country, ranks 50th in terms of ease of voting. But again, in the long run, it doesn't necessarily do what the opponents of those laws think it does. Voter ID laws. First voter ID laws in 2003 in Georgia and Indiana. You see states that have different voter ID laws. Again, the thought is that it's a means of suppressing people who have no means of getting a photo ID. I mean, that's the explicit purpose. If you look at the people earlier last decade who did not have a government-issued photo ID, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately poor, and disproportionately young. So if you're trying to keep young people of color without much money from voting, it could be a very effective means of voter suppression. All right, now hold that thought, because again, have we got evidence from states that have used it that it actually keeps these people from voting? Not necessarily. The Republicans see it as a partisan incentive. So you see that people in those categories I mentioned before, of color, poor, younger, they tend to vote Democratic. So Republicans were looking at data just like this when they started pushing for voter ID laws. Generally, the Supreme Court has upheld voter ID laws. So whereas in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, the Supreme Court was more favorable to expansion of voting rights. It hasn't always been the case. In 2008, Crawford was a case, and they basically, that bulleted point at the bottom, just because there was a partisan interest does not mean the law should be thrown out. So the court first recognized in this century, we can't be worried about partisanship. So that's a big change in the court. The people who voted for it were Republican appointees, so they had the court on their side. Justice Souter made a very impassioned dissent in Crawford and said that to get a photo ID issued by a government was an unreasonable burden for some people. People who are poor, don't have a car, who are sick or infirm, makes a difference. So Judge Souter recognized that his fellow justices had changed their tune. The big case that struck down part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, was Shelby County versus Holder, 2013. It basically said, Section 4, designating those states and parts of states as places where discrimination happened, including Wilson, North Carolina, and Section 5, because the justices, including the Chief Justice John Roberts, argued that racial discrimination was in the past, invalidated Section 5. So now we don't have preclearance. So North Carolina, since 2013, has enacted voter laws that make it easier to manipulate the system. Let me give you an example that I tell my students. In 2012, there was a voting site on the Appalachian State University campus in Boone, North Carolina. Student turnout was, of students who lived in that particular precinct, student turnout was about 80%. For young people, that's extraordinary. Well, even back in 2012, young people tend to vote Democrat. Right after this ruling was made by the Supreme Court, the County Board of Elections, in the county where Boone is, voted to remove that voting poll place from the Appalachian State campus. They located it 3 miles away. All right? Next presidential election was 2016. Any guesses about what the turnout of Appalachian State students was in 2016? Under 50%. So again, it empowered states, counties, boards of elections to start making changes to the voting system. In that case, it was for young voters. There are other things that have happened in North Carolina that have obviously happened to disenfranchise people of color. The redistricting that happened in 2021 is a great example. And again, the Shelby majority were Republican appointees. The effects not only hit North Carolina, but they hit almost every state that was under Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. Texas made the most restrictive voter ID law in the country. Whereas in Texas, then, a concealed handgun permit or license was an acceptable form of voter ID, but a student photo ID was not. The Supreme Court upheld it. So again, if you're looking for periods in history in which there have been advances in voting and regression in voting, follow the Supreme Court. Obviously, during the 2020 presidential election, we know that. It was very recent. There were unprecedented amounts of voting, including mail-in voting. Turnout was at an almost all-time high. And then we know the story that happened. So Biden wins, primarily using absentee ballots. In-person voting went primarily for Trump. Absentee ballots, which were used because of COVID to more so than they would have otherwise used, they went to Biden. So now we've seen a whole wave of new laws coming through the states. These states have passed laws making election interference, making it easier to challenge citizen voting. Remember, Lisa told us about what happened in the 50s. We're returning to the 50s, where there is now the ability in these states, and perhaps others by the time 2024 comes around, to challenge either voter registration or to challenge voters in the polling places. The biggest issue I have this year in 2022 is that the General Assembly has passed a law that makes it easier for poll watchers to go into polling places. Everybody know what a poll watcher is? All right, so people who watch you vote. They can challenge you. That's been made easier. Restricted voting laws. Several states have passed laws to make it more difficult to register. You have to show a proof of being a U.S. citizen in order to register. Some states, like Connecticut, have expanded their voting. They have made no excuse absentee voting, which we have in North Carolina, their law. Other states have made it even more difficult to do mail-in voting. Some states have moved to what's called a two-witness system. So when you fill out an absentee ballot, you have to have not one witness, but two witnesses sign it. That's a problem for a lot of people. Well, we know the Democrats have not stood by idly. They have tried to pass some legislation to try to deal with some of these state efforts. H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 have passed the U.S. House, not passed the U.S. Senate. But I'm here to tell you that even though I said that voter suppression can be, by and large, overcome, I have real concerns that if federal legislation is not passed, it may not necessarily affect the outcome in 2022, but it may affect the outcome in future elections. So Democrats have tried since 2016 to do things like have what are called automatic voter registration, not just motor voter. So you are, the moment you turn 18, you are registered to vote unless you opt out. You can see the states that do it. They're primarily, with some exceptions, democratically controlled states. There are a few exceptions there. So Democrats are fighting back at the state level. But again, I think it's going to take federal legislation. Fraudulent voting, it's extremely almost non-existent. It's extremely rare. In-person voting, about 1 in 2.5 million votes is considered to be illegal. So at 0.00004%. Even with mail-in voting, it's 0.0025%. So we're talking about all these laws are being passed at the state level because of the big lie that's been going on since 2020. Well, research does not support that there is significant fraud that goes on in the country, and you can find other examples of it. All right, so here's the sort of conclusion. There's a relationship between barriers to voting and turnout. the states on the left, Oregon, Washington, Utah, Maryland, Illinois, and so on and so forth, have much higher voting rates than the states on the right. The states on the right, if you look at the crowd of those states, Texas is out there, Georgia, South Carolina, the states that have passed laws making it more difficult to vote have lower turnout. All right. So again, there are barriers in 2022, just as there were in the 1950s, just as there were in the 1880s. Does it mean that all is lost and we throw up our hands and say, well, it's too bad, that's just the way it is? No. My lesson to my students is, if you live in Boone, North Carolina, I'll give you a ride to the polls, 3 miles, or whoever. You know, Uber, Lyft are giving free rides to the polls in a lot of communities. I'm not sure about Folsom. But there are ways, and that's one of my challenges, and I would just challenge all of you all that care deeply about voting in 2020 and 24. There are remedies out there. You need to make them widely known, whether it's Uber and Lyft for transportation to the polls, whether it's you have somebody who lives by herself because she's elderly and she wants to vote by mail, you make sure she gets a witness for her mail-in ballot. You know, we have a 2-week early voting period in North Carolina. We have no excuse absentee balloting. You know, again, North Carolina is not the most restrictive state, but it can be. But it is becoming, we're going back to the era of more restrictions. So the 70s, 80s, and 90s were the time in which expansion happened. Unfortunately, particularly after 2013, we're seeing those things being restricted. So I can't say it's entirely rosy, but I so much appreciate Lisa's optimism, and I'm going to take on her optimism and say, if Dr. Butterfield can do it, and the voters put him in office, you can put whoever you want in office.